everybody. And especially Alexander Etkind, Elke Fijn, and Valérie Picard. I'm glad you all three are here. Tonight is the first salon of a series of 4 salons, all about, in fact, how lasting peace in Europe can be realized. It's a very actual issue, also for people in the Netherlands, because the biggest party at this moment is a party who likes Russia. We don't, but okay. It's also interesting that at this moment we have another war. We have more wars in the world, but at this moment, of course, the war. Evitas. The war between Israel and Hamas also is, and there's a lot of attention going to that war. I observe at this moment, and there's less attention now for Ukraine, but nevertheless, it's very important what is happening with Russia and Ukraine, and there's also our relations between the wars, of course. Okay, we will dive into that the next weeks, and this evening, we will start with Alexander. Auke will introduce Alexander in a moment. Let's say the program of today is consisting of 2 blocks. We will start with an introduction presentation by Alexander. And then we have a Q&A, that's the first block. Then the second block will be a breakout group in Paris, and then let's say an exchange in the group. Alexander will not be there, so he will leave after the Q&A because he has other things to do. My name is Leida Schuringa. I'm one of the facilitators of tonight. The other ones are Auke van Nimwegen and Lars Lutje Schipholt. We make a recording of this salon and also of the next 3 salons because we think it's very important to spread the message. If you don't want to be on the video, you can stop your own video, and but of course we like to see your faces. The Salon of the Center for Human Emergence is not a debate or discussion. It is an inquiry in which we are listening to each other, to our inner voices and the voice of the whole. We ask you to listen with your heart, your whole body, and curiosity. Also, when you hear new things, surprising things, be curious. As a start, I will introduce the principles of the Center for Human Emergence in the Netherlands, because they lead the way into second-tier communication. Don't think about it, just sit grounded in your chair and listen with a beginner's mind. Our principles for cooperation are: the first, we assume oneness. The second, we acknowledge natural order in all life. Third, we enact the role that is ours to play. Fourth, we act when the time is right and hold when it's not. We clarify creative tension until new insight emerges. And we act from mutual trust and are accountable to each other and the whole at all times. Okay. Auke.
Okay, thank you, Leida. Yeah, before I get to the presentation of Alexander and his presentation, I want to say a few words about the whole series that we are presenting. It's been almost 2 years now since the full invasion of Russia into Ukraine, and I think it's made many of us aware that our democracy and peace are not only under threat there, but also in the rest of Europe. And the war, and this is in the Netherlands, we can our election results, although we're still pretty much a democracy, but you can see in our election results there's a pro-Putin government now, or a pro-Putin party that won the election. So will be interesting to see how that develops. The war is still going on, and but we're going to assume in our series of salons here that at some stage the Ukrainians manage to stop the Russian and regain the territory. And if that happens, we'll have to think about what's next, right? Because what is required at that moment in time to have sustainable peace in Europe. And Valerie and others from Ukraine have created what they call the Sustainable Peace Manifesto, and Valerie will talk about that in the third session of our series here. And amongst other things, the manifesto calls for an end to Russian colonialism. And this is something that few of us in the West are really aware of. Few in the West think of the Russian Federation as a colonial power. And we wanted to actually, to support this awareness. And we found that then we read the article in one of the Dutch newspapers of Professor Alexander Etkind, in which he also talks about Russian colonialism. And so we asked him to start this series of salons with giving us the historic perspective of that. Alexander also wrote this book, which is called Russia Against Modernity. I think it's something that every Westerner should read, especially those that still don't really understand the difference in thinking between the Russian leadership and most Western leaders. In this book, Alexander analyzes Russia's perspective on topics such as climate change and LGBTQ rights and other things, and he talks about what he calls the devaluation of Russia. Alexander was born in the Soviet Union and is a historian and a cultural scientist. He's professor of international relationships at the Central European University in Vienna. And he's also held senior positions at the European University Institute of Florence and in the University of Cambridge. He studied psychology, English, Slavonic studies, and cultural history. And he has taught in several places around the world. And this is not his first book. I already saw one of your slides, Alexander, that you put some other books there. So there will be more. If you're interested after this session, there's a lot more to read by Alexander. For those that are here and that expect us to use spiral dynamics and integral theory to analyze things, this is not a language that Alexander uses, but you will recognize what I would call the verticality in how he analyzes what's happening in Russia and in the world. So and there's just different terminologies he uses that, but I think most of us won't find it very difficult to translate that to the value systems as we know that. Okay, so welcome, Professor Alexander Etkind, and the floor is yours for the next 45 minutes.
Thank you very much, Leida and Auke, and everyone who has come tonight to this talk. Give me a second, so I want to share the screen. Oh God, something happened, it disappeared. Okay, give me 2 seconds.
Well, Alexander is looking at that. For those of you that have just joined, please put your country name behind your name so that we know where you're from. Thank you.
Okay, do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Excellent. So I just wanted to start from showing you my several books of mine in which I kind of prepared this conversation with you. The first one, I mean, I wrote much more, but I will not bother with you with that. But the first book that is relevant was published well before the current war in 2011. It's called Internal Colonization, Russia's Imperial Experience. And I actually, some of the stuff that I will be talking about, I will, okay. I will rely on the material from this book. And Morrison book, and that's kind of thick and very pretty academic book. It's called Nature's Evil, A Cultural History of Natural Resources, in which I'm talking about, exactly natural resources from the start to the current moment, like from grain and timber to gas and oil. And the title, Nature's Evil, shows my take on the issues with these resources. Evil is rooted in the inequality based in nature. It would be interesting to see, to learn how close or rather distant the moral and philosophical take in this book is from your methodology. If there will be some kind of chance to discuss that, that would be fantastic. And the last one, it's a very recent book written during the culmination of the war, basically during in 2022, and it was just written in a few months and published in a few months, called Russia Against Modernity. Basically, that's specifically the book about the roots, immediate roots and context of the Russian war in Ukraine. So in my talk today, I will be, as it was arranged or commissioned by the organizers, I will be talking mostly about the Russian imperialism / colonialism / revanchism, those ideological and historical roots of the current war. And I will start pretty far, but I will also try to keep it close to the contemporary realities, because I'm sure that you are more interested in the current events than in the distant history. But history gives context. It doesn't mean that history just reproduces itself. It doesn't. History does go continuously. It's full of disruptions and contingencies. Things just happen as we see it, day after day. So looking deep in the past, it's not about claiming this continuity. It's more like about learning the lessons. Okay, so yeah. Here is sort of this. This is the map of Russia, and the explications are in Russian, but I will just try to explain you what it is about. Russia consists of many different administrative districts. Some of them are called regions, some of them are called governances, some of them are even called republics. And they have distinct borders, they have capitals, they have some administrative apparatus in these capitals. They are all subordinate, of course, to the Russian Federation, which capital is Moscow. They are hugely unequal. The regional inequality of the Russian Federation is probably the highest in the world. Economic inequality is also very high and still growing. And Russia, before 2022, Russia very successfully competed with Brazil for the title of the most unequal country with the highest economic inequality. But that's usually we are talking about inequality in terms of social groups, so actually individuals between different, statistical citizens of the country. But here we're talking about regional inequality. And different lands in Germany, they're also not exactly equal. There are disparities between different states of the United States, or between England and Scotland and Wales. So inequality, of course, there are, as long as there are composite states, the states that consist of different units, defined politically, ethnically, culturally, administratively. There is some inequality, but Russia's inequality, in plain economic terms, probably is regional inequality is by far the highest in the world. So on this map,
Alexander, there are some requests if you can make the slides full screen. I think some people are on their phone, and I don't know if that's at all possible, but
that will take a minute to slide full screen. That this will not happen. Yeah. Does this help? What I did now?
Not really. No.
I think it's a PDF, and you just can click.
And I just have to go back to
the close that on the bar on the left.
No, I cannot. Oh yeah. Okay. Yes. Wow.
Oh, that's better. Yeah. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks. I thought that it wouldn't work, but actually it works miraculously. Okay. So basically, we see here, like from the light blue, which is the which you see here some very big regions of Siberia and the Urals, huge masses of land with relatively little population. And due to their natural wealth, and mostly, of course, nowadays this wealth is measured in barrels of oil, but also cubic meters of gas, in some cases diamonds, but largely by far this wealth consists of hydrocarbons, that carbohydrates that, yeah, that are going to export to the countries of the West, and now increasingly the countries of the East. So this 8 regions.
Altijd hetzelfde.
Sorry? What was that? Should I continue?
Yeah, there was someone shouting something, but please continue.
So these eight regions that are on this map are colored in light blue. They have the level, the life standards of the developed countries of the first world, like European countries, members of the EU, or the Netherlands, or some of the richest countries of Asia, such as Singapore. On the other hand, when we go to, say, yellow, this is, you see these are peripheral regions of Asian Russia, but also the Central Russia, the European part of Russia, the Russian heartlands, the historical kind of roots of the Russian statehood. And this yellow colored lands, they have life standards close to, I'm just reading, close to, they say, Brazil or Iran. While the parts of the map that are colored in brown and even worse, dark brown, that they have the regional product per capita, basically quality of life, equal to countries such as Pakistan or Paraguay, some of the poorest countries of the world. So it's all belongs to one country. This country is very big. It's by its territory, it's the biggest country on the planet. But there are all kinds of redistribution schemes so that these richer parts of the land gives basically transfers money to the poorest land. But what we see on this map is the end result: a huge inequality, which basically models the generic inequality of the planet, with its first world, the former second world, and the third world, you know, from the richest to the poorest regions of one and the same country. So what's the secret? Of course, the secret is natural resources. That's a part of the story that really profitable, meaning expensive. It also means these resources are very rare. It means that exactly they are rare and they're expensive. That means that these resources, such as oil or diamonds, one could find it in one place, and one could not have it, could not find it in many, many, many other places of the world. And people go to transporting these resources across the oceans or across the continents by tankers or by pipelines in order to realize this wealth, basically in order to get the profit that comes from the rarity, geographical rarity of these resources. Here on this chart, it's kind of also would be difficult for you to see it, but here here is the list of all these different regions and republics, etc. As you see, there are many of them, and 100% is the average. So only these regions have life standards higher than the average, and these are those oil-bearing parts of Siberia again, and metal-bearing parts of the Ural Mountains, and also Moscow and St. Petersburg, which have a huge taxation base, because some of the biggest oil and gas trading companies, such as, say, Gazprom and Rosneft, are registered in Moscow and Petersburg, and they pay taxes, even though their wealth clearly comes from the same areas of Eastern Siberia or Western Siberia. They pay taxes to the cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, while all this part of the map gets much less than. So it's coming from 200% plus, or 350 here. That's exactly the so-called Khanty-Mansi and Tyumen regions where oil is, all the way to whatever 25% of the average regional income. And now we go from this, more or less familiar economic terrain. We're going to something rather new and uncharted. But that's, of course, in the context of the current war, that's hugely important. Here we see how many conscripts from different regions are there in the standing army, in the army that actually fights right now in Ukraine. And look, so there are, let's say, from Moscow, which has about 9 or 10% of the whole population of the Russian Federation. There is less than 1% of conscripts fighting in the army. Smaller, but also drastic discrepancies. The discrepancy for St. Petersburg. You see 4% of the population live in St. Petersburg and less than 1% is fighting. While exactly the opposite proportions are true for these vast regions of Siberia, the Urals. The farther you go, basically, from Moscow, either east, but also will be true if you go farther south to the Caucasus. The poorer are these regions, and the more conscripts are drawn from those regions. Why so? There are several explanations. One explanation is again economical, because some of these regions, such as say Buryatia or Dagestan, they are truly poor, and therefore those salaries that the Russian army pay to the conscripts very, very low, but they matter. The salaries matter for those dwellers of this really, really poor region that live like Paraguay or some poorest parts of Africa. But probably way more important is another kind of explanation that the whole mobilization strategy is directed towards getting conscripts into the army without causing too much social discontent, protest, or revolution. And this protest and revolution, the protest matters only in the capitals. Revolutions happen only in the capitals. Whatever protests there could be there in Siberia or in the Urals doesn't really matter. Therefore, St. Petersburg and Moscow are kept like in pristine, sort of innocent, quote unquote, condition. Of course, all decisions are made there, and much of the armament industry is also concentrated there. But conscripts come from the most distant and the poorest parts of Russia. So what I'm trying to say is that Russia basically is a country of, it's an imperialist country, and I will show you how it historically expanded. That was like it grew together with other great imperial states such as Spanish Empire, British Empire, and the French Empire, etc. Together simultaneously in competition with them, and that was the imperial expansion, external colonization. But also this huge expanse of the Russian territory, the biggest country in the world, treats its own internal parts as internal colonies. That's a process of internal colonization that I think is very important for understanding the process. It doesn't mean that Russia, whatever, prefers internal colonization to external colonization or whatever. And there is nothing specific about that. It is more about the historically changing combination of the external and internal processes of internal colonies that we need to understand in order to understand how Russia developed, grew, and how it is working now. Let's look at some of the one of the best known images coming from Russia. This is the bronze horseman monument to Peter the First in the very center of St. Petersburg. Peter the First, who actually founded the Russian Empire in 1725, he proclaimed his country, a country that he inherited as a Tsardom. He proclaimed its empire, and he became the first emperor, the first Russian emperor. You see a bronze monument to him, actually created by a French architect. And it's, you know, kind of romantic Baroque monument. So Peter sits on his horse, and the horse is kind of jumping ahead to the north. So Peter occupied these lands from Sweden, and Sweden is in the north across the Neva River at that time. So this dynamic movement basically is the movement of the imperial expansion of external colonization. And indeed, Peter the First, that's a unique case in history, that he actually established the capital of his, the new capital. The previous capital was Moscow. He established the capital of his country in an freshly occupied territory that was not even kind of, this annexation was not even recognized by any kind of international treaty. It happened later. So St. Petersburg was organized basically on an occupied territory. It's very different from Jerusalem, however, because Jerusalem is a very, very ancient city, and Peter the First established his capital, St. Petersburg. There was not much there. Some kind of Swedish villages and immense marshes. Another interesting detail: so the Peter's horse relies. Every horse sculpture has to have 3 points of support, so two legs, and here you see the tail relies on the snake, and that's a symbolism of evil and the idea that the empire conquers evil. So like only this imperial movement outwards conquers evil of this world. This is the meaning invested in this image. On this chart created by one Estonian historian, you see how the Russian Empire grew through centuries in comparison to other great empires. You see here. Ottoman Empire, you see the Polish empires, but Ottoman, Portugal, French, Spanish Empire, and the British Empire, and here we have the Russian. So as you see, and here are the centuries, the timeline, and here is the space measured in megameters, and 1 square megameter is equal to 1 million square kilometers. Anyway, that's imperial space. That's captured, colonized, annexated, occupied, annexated, colonized, appropriated space, which of course before this expansion belonged to someone else in all cases. So as you see, like Spanish Empire had its downfall, like in basically Napoleon put an end to it. Russia was very successfully competing with the British Empire, which had its moment of triumph in the 19th century. So when it lost America at that point, you know, but which at that point it had India, the whole subcontinent. So it controlled, it owned more space than Russia for a while. But then it all came to the end, and after the World War II, the USSR stayed there as basically their last surviving empire, consisting of the 15 republics, including the Russian Federation, including Ukraine, including the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Baltics. Then in 1991, those 14 republics ceded and withdrew from this empire. So the USSR collapsed in 1991, but the Russian Federation retained much of its space. Here we go, and basically on this level, nothing has changed from 91. Here is another way to see the same process of imperial expansion. Territory of the Russian state in 1500, 1600, and 1700. So this is how it works. And as you see, the expansion was going predominantly to the eastward, taking this huge expanses of Siberia and all the way to Alaska, including Alaska itself, which was sold to the United States, peacefully sold to the United States only in the mid-19th century. And also the south, parts of Ukraine, parts of Poland at some point, and the Caucasus. But even this, this dark green shows like the core territories of Russia before 1500. But of course, if we go seriously before 1500, we will see this kind of the same process, the expansion of the Russian statehood from Novgorod and from Kiev to Novgorod to Moscow. Basically, it's like from this area again to the east and south. From a small core nucleus, it goes all the way across the continent of Eurasia. Why did it happen? What for? Why, these huge expanses of swamps and forests, sometimes mountains, but mostly it's just one kind of eternal, limitless marshes going through the north and the east, with some endemic tribes that were not very hospitable. Sometimes some of them were trying to avoid these Russian settlers. Many of them actually rebelled and confronted them by the arms that they had. But there were Cossacks, there were soldiers, there were also merchants at some point. And of course the state officials who were running that march to the east that took several centuries. What for? Basically, the answer is strangely simple. It was always about fur and not much else. There were woods and marshes. There was, of course, timber, but timber could not be transported through all these huge distances. There was no trade in timber till railway appeared in the late 19th century. I mean, with Siberia, with Siberian timber. What was tradable was fur, and there were several species of fur-bearing animals, starting from a very modest squirrel, which was killed in millions and millions, starting from the Novgorod stage of Russian history. But the most desired and most valuable fur was sable, and sable, of course, was this pelts are very light, they're dry, they do not rot if they would be like transported in the proper way. they would safely come all the way, usually in the winter, by the snow routes, by sledges, all the way from West Siberia across the Urals, across central Russia, and then by the Russian rivers would go to Germany and France and Great Britain, and would be paid generously paid in silver or gold that Russia did not have. This is the kind of the first itinerary for that gray squirrel, which was the largest commodity of the medieval Novgorod. The very kind of cradle, the very basis of the Russian sovereignty. So the merchants of Novgorod really were killing and dressing these gray squirrels in millions pelts every season. And it went from Novgorod through the system of Russian rivers and lakes to the Baltic, and then to northern Germany, Lübeck, Hamburg. And there they were processed and by the Gaza, by the Hansa ships. They were traded mostly by northern Germans, who kept in Novgorod a permanent representation, like trade representation. It was actually called the German colony in Novgorod. In case you haven't noted it yourself, but this is exactly the way in which Nord Stream 1 and 2 actually is, or rather was, going through the Baltic from the harbors near St. Petersburg, through the Gulf of Finland, the Baltic, to northern Germany. And the transition from Novgorod to Moscow, like Novgorod was massacred by the Muscovite troops. That was, one could argue, also a sort of internal colonization. And that happened actually because the market of gray squirrel collapsed in Europe. Wool was just better, lighter, cheaper, warmer, sheep wool, and it made this gray squirrel pelts undesired. So Moscow could actually take Novgorod. That was the project of funds. And then Moscow took Kazan, and Moscow expanded into Siberia and discovered sable there in West Siberia. And just by pure chance, the parts of Siberia where the Muscovites sourced sable were pretty much the same parts of Siberia where, centuries later, the Muscovites found oil. And again, there's routes, that pipelines, and sledge, there's modern pipelines more or less go in the same, by the same routes as the ancient sledge caravans with sable fur. That's an interesting map of 1830. It's like post-Napoleonic era. And that's an interesting projection, which really makes the Russian Empire, colored here in green, the master of the world. At least, almost all the northern hemisphere is largely taken in this projection. That's kind of an artistic device. Was taken by the Russian Empire, which included, and it's very, very prominent on this particular map, included a big chunk of Northern America. And why Alaska was so desired by the Russian also troops and Cossacks and merchants, because of still another kind of fur, which was the sea otter. If you were in California, you probably saw sea otters. They are very kind of charming, and nowadays very well protected species. but they were exterminated fully from Alaska, along with some other fur bearing animals like salons, etc. But sea otters were by far the most desirable because they were bought by Chinese for extraordinary prices, because the ceremonial dress of the Chinese emperor and the top officials of the court was made of sea otter, and only few basically islands and the coast of Alaska had them. And of course, as it happened with sables were fully exterminated, and then the Cossacks. That's why the Cossacks went eastward, farther and farther east, trying to find another source of wealth. And they found sea otters, which they, with the help of the, with the help of the local tribes, whom they forced to hunt or trap those animals, they exterminated. So both, as the end result, both the animals and the local tribes were largely exterminated by the Russians who were trading there. So here is my kind of, it's a little kind of theoretical diversion, but here is my kind of simple idea that really colonization, we usually understand colonization as an external activity, like the British Empire went to America, to India, to Africa, to whatever, Australia, very far away, and got its colonies. Colonies, of course, were usually about particular kind of resources, whether it was sugar or cotton or metals or whatever, ivory, etc., etc. And then so colonies were appropriated, so the surplus, they were growing economically, but the surplus was returning to the metropolis, say to the English Isles. And that's the typical process of external colonization. But the United Kingdom also includes Scotland, Northern Ireland, previously, so all Ireland was the British colony, so Wales. And this is internal colonization. This is the, on this chart on the bottom. These are internal spaces and also internal peoples. They are internal in the sense that they are dwelling, they're located within the established borders of a particular state. So if this is, if or when these borders are pushed outwards and external spaces have been, conquered, that's external colonization. But then in this, huge new space, there are internal parts that are also exploited, and there could be also cases of genocide, and but also the Enlightenment, and also the all kinds of stratigraphical and ethnographic discoveries. And it's as in the but the process of external colonization and internal colonization are largely similar. They are geographically different, but in many cases, in many ways, they are very similar. It's usually about natural resources and the exploitation of the locals. And now, of course, we have the Soviet Union, in which the Russian Federation, colored here on this map in yellow, dominates territorially. It dominated in all possible ways, militarily, economically, administratively. And on the periphery, there were very substantial lands or countries that were subordinated by the Soviet Union, and they were not really called the Soviet colonies, but they were colonies, I think. There is, I mean, that's in so many ways that they were colonies of the Moscow metropolis. Places like Kazakhstan here, green, or Ukraine here, Belarus, etc., and the Baltic countries and the Caucasus. And they kind of, by another chance of history in 1991, a kind of process that feels almost mysterious nowadays, because that was like a peaceful transformation of a large and powerful empire into, transformation and decolonization of that powerful state. And that was connected to economic decline, to the fall of oil prices, for instance, that were, for the late Soviet Union, were still the backbone, already the backbone of its economic existence. But also it was defined by the emancipation movements in the Baltic countries, in Ukraine, also in Belarus and Kazakhstan. And what was kind of extraordinary, particularly in the current context, is that it was peaceful. Empires very rarely collapse or would be dismembered without major conflicts, usually military conflicts. Both world wars were connected to this sort of the disputes between the falling empires who were kind of holding on to their colonies or trying to get someone else's colonies. And as the American historian Timothy Snyder argues, for the Second World War, the key object of dispute as the most kind of profitable colony was Ukraine. But there, of course, there were other, interesting parts of Europe and Eurasia that were subject to the military conflict. But the Soviet Union collapsed with no major war. There were victims, dozens of victims, in some cases, probably hundreds of victims in the Baltics, in the Caucasus, due to some popular riots or protests that were brutally suppressed by the troops sent from Moscow. But still, there was no major war. And one could argue, I think, that the success of those politicians, of that generation of politicians, was to defer this violence, this major war, say by 30 years. So the conflict that we're seeing now is basically the deferred war that was successfully postponed in 1991. If so, that was indeed a success. 30 years of relative peace on this huge part, in this huge part of the world. This is something. That was a serious achievement. But the war, as we know, has come again. And of course, once again, it's really connected to the basic kind of material underpinnings of global economy, which in this case, you see on this map, you see oil and gas pipelines that used to go from West Siberia to Europe, Northern Europe, Southern Europe. So, some of them actually, in fact, those that used to be the most important of these pipelines went through Ukraine. And amazingly, the most important pipelines still go through Ukraine, and they are still functioning. They still pump gas across Ukraine. So there are, shells and drones and bombs and missiles exploding everywhere on the Ukrainian territory, but both sides escape to explode these pipelines, even though technically, of course, that would be the easiest thing to do for either side, because that gives both sides serious money. Gazprom, every month of the war, Gazprom transfers to Ukraine several billions dollars. And of course, Gazprom and the Russian Federation was trying to go around Ukraine to build the pipelines to the north from Ukraine or to the south from Ukraine. And they spent many billions for building these pipelines, such as, for instance, Nord Stream 1 and 2, or the Southern Stream that goes through Turkey. But that's a kind of one of the miracles of this war, is that those pipelines that go through the peaceful Baltic Sea were actually exploded. We don't know by whom still, while the pipelines that go through the fighting Ukraine have still survived. And of course, this geographically, as you see it, this sort of move of highly valuable commodities geographically reproduce that movement of fur that was going on through those lands from the medieval times till the 19th century. Of course, it has changed largely due to sanctions that European countries, the members of the European Union, and the United States have imposed on the import of Russian oil, not so much on gas. And this oil now goes, as we know, across the world to India and China. But I'm about to finish my story, but I think that's highly relevant to understand, just also to understand how this world works now, or maybe it doesn't work in the way that we would like it to work. But this oil basically is that would have gone to Germany or Italy or whatever, or the Balkans, is now diverted. So it goes still by the same pipelines across the Urals and the Russian heartland here to the harbors near St. Petersburg. There are basically two commercial harbors with oil terminals, and then it's loaded onto the tankers, mostly Greek tankers, but also Russian tankers and some other tankers. And then these tankers go, and that's very interesting. They go across through the Danish Straits, which is a very narrow straits, like passages. They are so narrow that for every tanker with Russian oil, there should be a Danish pilot who boards this tanker and navigates it through Danish Straits. And of course, Russia pays, or whatever, this shipping company pays to Denmark, whatever, a fee for this pilot. So then it goes across the Baltic and then across the Atlantic and then around Africa, or maybe through the Suez, but mostly around the world. And then it goes, to the Indian and Chinese harbors. So this trade, of course, could have been stopped either by Denmark or by the European Union anytime at will. But this trade still ships very significant, I would say huge amounts of Russian oil to the countries that are buying it, avoiding oil caps imposed by the European Union, getting very serious discounts from Russia. But basically, whatever discounts there are, this money, billions of dollars every month, every week, they finance the Russian war in Ukraine. Okay, on this, if you have some sort of time and interest, I want to show you interesting pictures. Is that okay? It's a little bit entertaining, I think, to see this classical canvas by Ilya Repin, the great Russian artist, who actually lived most of his life in Finland, but was born in Ukraine. And it shows the Cossacks of Zaporozhye, the Dnieper Cossacks, who are writing a letter to the Turkish Sultan. And of course, that's about the yoke or the taxes, basically about the taxes that the Sultan wanted them to pay. And they say, no, we will not pay you these taxes. And that's like, and they kind of ridicule the whole thing, the Sultan and the taxes and the imperial claims coming, in this case, from the Ottoman Empire onto this Dnieper lands. And this is a reenactment of this picture created quite recently, but probably a couple of months ago, near the front line by a French photographer, Émeric Liuzet. So he asked the Ukrainian soldiers to sit like in the same positions around the table. And also, they're also kind of writing something or discussing something, and clearly they say no. And the same kind of gesture here as in the previous picture, but now probably it points to the north. In the previous picture, it pointed to the south. You see this, the same. So that was going to like Istanbul. That's gesture, and this gesture, of course, goes to Moscow, but saying no. And there are interesting. I mean, it's like a fascinating art product with the interesting detail that there are some differences between the old picture and the new one. And the most impressive difference actually is the figure of the female soldier, who of course is very kind of common in the Ukrainian army, but was absolutely impossible to among the Cossack troops. All right, and so where does it go? Here is another art product, nothing more than an art product, but basically that's someone's anonymous fantasy. Map of the prospective successor states of the Russian Federation with their flags, national symbols. As with basically those very administrative districts or regions and republics that we discussed at the start. Of course, if Russia really loses this war, and if Russia would be really deprived of its source of income, which is the oil and gas from here, from Western Siberia, then I believe it would actually collapse more or less in this, and would be would decompose, disintegrate, more or less according to this scenario. But so far we don't see it happening. We see very different dynamics right now, unfortunately, in Europe and in the world. But I think even Danish pilots could make it happen anytime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. We'll talk to the Danish pilots. Good. Anybody, any questions? Maybe you can stop sharing the screen and then we can have the...
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody?
There are some questions in the chat, I guess. Or what is that in the chat?
Yeah, there's no question. That's not... Leida has a question, please.
Please.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the whole overview. And I'm wondering, modernity. So that the Russian war, you said it's also a war against modernity. Can you say something about that?
The question is like, what do I mean by modernity? This is the question. Or...
Nope.
Yeah, yes, I do claim that this is the war against our new modernity, the current moment in the long story of modernity. Of course, modernity is a very old and somehow discredited word. But I'm trying to define what is new and what is particular for the current moment, for the current modernity. And to me, it's all connected to climate change and the Anthropocene. And I contrast, I say, so that the Soviet Union was a great manifestation of paleomodernity, I call it paleomodernity. The masses of concrete and oil and things were big and tall, and the bigger they were, the more modern they were. The higher the skyscrapers, the bigger the engines, etc. And of course, that led to emissions. The more energy was used, the more emissions were created, the more modern was an enterprise or a particular achievement. And we're living now in the, in an entirely different or possibly the opposite moment. I call it Gaia modernity. I take this concept from Bruno Latour, the French philosopher and sociologist who was working on that concept of Gaia. I will not go that far right now, but the idea is, in my speculation, is that the Gaia modernity is pretty much the opposite. The smaller things, the small is beautiful. The less energy is created for the same unit of work or pleasure, entertainment. The more modern is this device or event or moment. And this transition, basically, it's another word for it is very familiar, like decarbonization, green transition. Decarbonization deprives petrostates such as Russia, but not only Russia, also countries such as Iran or say Qatar or Saudi Arabia, etc., Nigeria, and even Norway. Decarbonization deprives those countries that focus on the exporting their fossil fuel of their core income. It is in the existential interest of those petrostates to stop or reverse these processes. And of course, different countries, respond to this critical situation in different ways. Norway is, it's drilling lots of oil, but it's selling this oil, and someone else is burning this oil. But Norway doesn't use this money, it locks this money into a particular safe place, into the fund for the future generations. But for countries like Iran or Russia or Venezuela, this money is existential, meaning that they have no other existence but by exporting this fossil fuel. So, and we saw it on the maps, we saw it in deeper history. For me, this transition across centuries from fur to oil is kind of interesting. And therefore, I see this is my story. I see this war in Ukraine along with some other previous some other events and acts and initiatives coming from Moscow as a step in basically blocking this transition to new modernity. So in my book I analyze what the Russian officials and experts and whoever told about climate change, all these stories of denialism, or even ideas that as a northern country, Russia would benefit from climate change, which of course is entirely wrong. And then there were some ideas of how Russia could actually benefit from taking part in the European emission trading schemes. That's actually was an interesting and largely unknown part of kind of Russian political debate. But that would take lots of change on all, in diplomatic and economic initiative that was not available. And the solution was found in this barbaric war. And of course, the war, while it has started and while it was kind of invented in the context of that postponed violence, the kind of post-imperial transition, which of course was very, very painful for Russia. This war has its own dynamics, and the dynamics is absolutely tragic. And we are now in some of the most dramatic turning points of this war.
Thank you. Saskia, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your very interesting discourse and to look at it this way. It's more a remark than a question. I always thought the same of the United States of America. I can't wait till that falls apart. And the other and the signs are not that big either. And the other point is, if you, from your story, I fully agree with the this extremely unfortunate war. But if you say that the Ukraine needs to win, for me that also implies that NATO wins, and that prospect is not that welcome to me. I don't think if the world would be a much better place if NATO can claim to win and then continue what it has been doing, and that is also a form of colonialism in my view. So how can we get out of this colonial game? Because it is that it's totally in a power struggle between the big powers in the world.
Well, the NATO is an international organization. It's not really a kind of sovereign power. to say that the NATO is an empire, I think that would be very, that would be a stretch. Or saying that the European Union is an empire, as some kind of Europhobes are telling us now. There is a huge difference between the way in which things are being done in Moscow and the way in which things are being done, say, in Washington or in Brussels. And this difference is, to me, that defines the whole kind of story. And of course, Ukraine does need international support. And since the NATO is a major and the biggest and by far the most powerful military international organization, the NATO is there. But who is actually making decisions for the NATO? Why, is Americans, whatever, Europeans? Americans obviously dominate there. Yes, as you see probably from my talk, I would rather prefer that NATO would be way more direct and aggressive in this particular case. The NATO made many mistakes, we all know them, in the past. Also has some major achievements. The Cold War didn't turn into the hot one because of the NATO, also because of the kind of relative wisdom of the Soviet leaders comparing to the current Russian leaders who really wanted the war, and they have gotten it. And yes, I would like the NATO to be, as well as other Ukrainian allies, to be more decisive and more consistent in the military and economic and moral support for Ukraine. And I think the drama of this particular moment is that this support is under question. There is no decisiveness that this war needs. And what the Russian government wants from this war is to continue it. The stalemate is the ideal situation for the Muscovite leaders. And of course, it's hugely damaging to Ukraine. I think it is also very, very challenging to the world.
Thanks, Alexander. I just want to make two comments on that, and that is there is a great book by Mary Saritoni, which is called Not 1 Inch, who's explored NATO expansion, and it's very informative because it gives lots of facts. And I think it's also good to remember that NATO is an organization that people join freely. So that's, unlike what Alexander talked about in Russia, where this expansion is done by conquering. NATO doesn't conquer. No, that's the fact. That's how NATO operates. Alexander, I had a question about how realistic do you think, so you showed all these nations, right? And Valery pointed to the fact that this actually comes from the League of Nations, this map. And how realistic do you think such a falling apart of the Russian Federation is? And do you see in all of these regions movements for independence, as much as that's possible within the current Russia?
Well, in the current Russia, not much is possible. As you know, it's basically a totalitarian control over the mass media, social media, any sort of manifestation, protest movement, whatever, is brutally suppressed. Leaders are either in exile. There is 1 million of Russians who basically don't disagree They have been they are abroad now, and mostly in Europe, but everywhere in the world. There are many more who disagree, and they just are pathetically silent for over there in Russia. But before the war, before say 2014, the war started in 2014. But before, and that also changed the atmosphere in Russia hugely. But before it started, there were serious nationalist and emancipation movements in different parts of Russia. Of course, in the Caucasus, we remember two Chechnya wars, that were brutally brutally suppressed by the force of the Russian army, and then basically people were just rudely bought, were bribed by huge sums of money. Also unprecedented, actually, sums. Where this money came from, of course, from the same source, from oil that was traded with, say, Germany. And by the way, there is this responsibility, like if we're talking about all this money, all the economic sides of things, there is a responsibility of the producer or of the seller, and also the responsibility of the buyer, of the consumers. All this money that are circulating there, they were basically given in exchange by someone, mostly by Europeans, some by Americans, some by the Chinese, etc. Yes, and I think that this federation would survive. So this map would not be relevant. This map was created by one maverick, actually. He's a friend of mine on Facebook, and but then it was it was circulating. People really debating the border, already debating the borders and flags. This forum is not, doesn't represent a significant force, unfortunately, at this point. But I think the Russian Federation took a huge risk, unmanageable risk, when it started this war. And there have been military responses, which I think were largely successful to the Russian attack, and there were economic responses, which were largely a failure. And here we're coming back to oil and Danish pilots and everything that has been discussed, and the responsibility of the buyers. And this economic aspect of this war, economic warfare, it means sanctions, it means the price cap, it means many other things that have not been really have been promised by Western countries but have not been delivered. Yeah, so if they were delivered, then this map would be highly relevant, because all the force, all the power of Moscow comes from those financial transfers that it gives to places like Dagestan or places like Tuva, etc., etc. And the money, basically, the Russian money is a converted form of oil that had been traded with someone, with Germany or with China, etc. So the key to this map, actually, in the context of this war, the key belongs not even to Ukraine. So of course Ukraine has a big say in this story, but the key belongs to the international community. Those people who work on sanctions, on financial flows, on price cap, etc.
Good. Thank you very much, Alexander. We've sort of come to the end of the time we had reserved for our Q&A. We've gone a little bit over time, but I really appreciate your insights into this. Thank you very much. I just want to remind everybody again, Alexander's book, because especially comparing the different empires in this world. This will give you a good insight in what things look like within Russia, and I think that is a view that that is not very well known in the West, unfortunately. So thank you for writing that book and making an effort to educate us, Alexander.
It was a pleasure, and have a great discussion.
Yeah.
And good luck to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.